welcome into another edition of Discern. I'm Ross, and I'm joined this week by Mark Turman at the Denison Forum. Hello, Mark.
Hey, Ross. Great to be back with you.
It's awesome to have you back. We're going to visit this week on the topic of poverty. We're going to talk about wealth distribution. There's social policy conversations, and then there's just the practical impact that poverty is having amidst COVID. So we're just going to be hitting this week this concept of poverty. We're going to start with an article from the Jordan Times about the film Parasite. It says the 2019 Oscar-winning film Parasite attracted a global audience for its arresting portrayal of South Korea's stark income inequality. The movie's rendering of a low-income household's acute sense of alienation resonated widely, no doubt because similar sentiments are palpable in many other countries, and the gap between the haves and have-nots is growing thanks to the dual challenges of COVID-19 and climate change. Mark, as we just open this week talking about poverty, there's a passage in John, and I'll paraphrase it, but essentially Jesus says, "The poor will always be among you, but I will not always be among you." That passage is one that a lot of times people tie to poverty and the concept of the poor, and I've even had situations where I've served in shelters, and it's come up several times. Can you speak to that passage and then maybe just kind of bring us into this conversation about poverty?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand the context of what's going on in that statement. Jesus is preparing for the cross, and that statement is made in the context of helping the people with him that day to understand the sacrifice that the woman had come into the room, and she was spiritually moved to honor him in preparation for his sacrifice on the cross and for his burial. And one of the things that they did in those days was to when they buried somebody, they anointed them with oil. There was probably more to it than that, but she was doing this as an act of worship, as an act of devotion. And when she used her perfume for that, very expensive, very important and significant asset for her and for her family, when she poured that perfume out on Jesus and wiped his feet in preparation for the cross and for the burial, she was criticized by the disciples for what they thought was wasteful use of an expensive asset. And that's where Jesus said, "You don't understand. This is a special moment. This is a right thing for her to do." And he says, there will be the poor among you. There will be opportunities pretty consistently for you to share resources with others, material as well as others. But this is a right use of what she's doing. And so you have to take that context into consideration when you're hearing this statement. Jesus was not making a public policy statement. He was not even so much making a statement about those that have versus those that have not. You can connect that, I think, in some ways, but that's not the immediate purpose. What he was defending her. He was defending her act of worship. He was defending her devotion that she had been providentially and spiritually moved to make.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think that the misconception sometimes with that passage, anytime you take scripture out of context, watch out, right? We've talked about that before, but I think even some of the people I've talked to have said, well, was Jesus then saying, well, there are always going to be different levels of income or different levels of wealth. That just is what it is, almost like a sense of people have kind of taken it to mean it's a sense of hopelessness that Jesus was expressing. But I think we would instead, we can point to other cases, and I'd love for you to expound on it. As we just think about poverty in the Bible, clearly Jesus was very directly addressing the poor in a lot of what he was saying, and we can even look to some of his famous sermons.
Yeah, Jesus definitely had a real passion and concern for those who were under-resourced, whether that was in a material sense. He was certainly caring for them. There wasn't much, if any, middle class in Jesus's day. It was definitely a have and have not world, with very few people from an economic standpoint, materially in the middle. And Jesus seemed to have a great affinity and a great attention that he gave to those who were not adequately resourced. He loved all people, whether they were rich or poor. and it wasn't a matter that anybody else was favored more than another, but he did have a certain compassion that was unique and focused on those that were struggling. But it wasn't just material. He cared about people who didn't have enough materially in terms of food and shelter. But he also cared about those that were poor in terms of their physical health. I was just reading this morning how Jesus came and took care and healed so many people that had so many kinds of brokenness in their physical bodies. And he fulfilled this prophecy of taking on their diseases and healing their brokenness. So he was concerned about that kind of poverty. The poverty of actual physical health is not just physical resources like food or shelter. He was obviously concerned about people who were spiritually poor, and even kind of turned our thinking around on that in Matthew 5 when he said that we needed to realize how spiritually poor we are so that we would be prepared and able to receive the grace and the forgiveness that he was going to provide through the cross. And so I think in the immediate context you brought up, obviously he is talking about material resources, but I don't think that's the only kind of poverty that Jesus was concerned about. And obviously spiritual poverty is the most serious kind.
Yeah, and you talk about the high class and low class and the lack of a middle in his day. I imagine that allowed for, a very stark contrast where, people would, if he's the king, if he's the Messiah, there was probably an expectation that he would go to the high class, at least in the religious realms of, the people who knew the law, that could recite the law, the people who may have even been expecting him. But we see time and time again where Jesus would really love both, and in many cases even make a point to go to the lower class and meet physical needs and address their spiritual needs at the same time.
Right, and sometimes he would make heroes out of those that were in the lower class or those that didn't have very much resource. He was very clear, very compassionate, but also very clear about the ability of material prosperity to blind us in many ways and to blind us spiritually. He said some very strong things in that direction.
Yeah, and it's just, even as we wrap up today's intro to poverty, it just reminds me that even the terms high class, low class bear with them a certain load, meaning it sort of implies that, okay, so the amount of wealth I possess indicates my rank or value within society. And certainly that's what Jesus was going right at, is he's like, oh, this is such the danger of money, is that it would put us in this place where we start to assume a person's worth or value relative to God is somehow tied to the amount of coins they have in their possession. And so even those terms, as we use them, really pretty casually today, it forces some reflection on, we need to be just always aware of what it's like to be in these different so-called classes, and the reality that in God's eyes, wealth is not a determining factor in value in the kingdom. And so I think we'll stop there as we think through poverty. And again, we're going to get the remaining episodes this week. We're going to talk about how this plays out throughout the world and in this country as well. So thanks, Mark. It's been a good discussion today.
Glad to be a part. Thanks, Ross.
We'll see everybody for the next discussion on this tomorrow on Discern.